With Russia's military continuing to advance and gain ground in Ukraine, Western countries have been considering every option available to support Ukraine and their defense. ATGMs and manpads have certainly helped, but they have not stopped Russia. With direct military intervention off the table due to the risks of starting a larger and possibly nuclear war, other, slightly less drastic measures have been discussed. Poland talking about giving Ukraine fighter jets, for example. But more popular has been the idea of establishing a no-fly zone. The idea is somewhat more attractive as it's not fully committing to fighting Russia head-on, just their air forces. The US and allies have done it before, in Iraq, Kosovo, and Libya. So, could it be done in Ukraine as well? First, help protect yourself online with our sponsor, NordVPN. VPNs are important for many reasons. Hackers intercepting and stealing your data, websites tracking and selling your data, different governments monitoring your data, the list goes on. And NordVPN does everything it can to keep you safe. And now, they're doing even more with their new threat protection. It comes included as a free edition, blocking trackers, malicious and intrusive ads, harmful websites and malware, and much more, further keeping you safe while browsing online. It automatically detects and blocks harmful websites, files that are sent to you, and much more. And once you switch it on, it can stay on even when you're not using a VPN, so you are always protected. NordVPN has won multiple awards for their products, and they're always highly recommended by tech experts. And now, with their new threat protection, they're giving their users a whole new suit of armor to keep them safe. Plus, with my link, a 2-year plan gets you a 72% discount, along with an additional month for free. And as always, they have their 30-day money-back guarantee policy. So again, check them out, NordVPN. For simplicity's sake, we'll consider just the US attempting to establish this no-fly zone. First, some basics. A no-fly zone, also called an air exclusion zone, is an airspace above a nation or part of a nation where all flights are restricted by airborne patrols. The point is, typically, to try to free up and protect units on the ground from any aircraft above. To do that, you have to be able to intercept and, if necessary, shoot down enemy aircraft. There's 2 ways to do this, with surface-to-air missile systems, like Patriot, and with fighter aircraft patrolling the skies. SAM systems are unlikely in this case. The Patriot PAC-2 missiles have a range of roughly 150 kilometers, and against more agile Russian strike and fighter aircraft, its effective range is much shorter. Moving Patriots into Ukraine and setting them up is likely too difficult and way too risky. The US did recently deploy 2 batteries to Poland near Ukraine's border, but again, it doesn't cover much except an area of western Ukraine where there is currently no fighting. Besides Patriot, there's no other systems with long enough range to cover Ukraine, so the only real option is fighter aircraft overhead. And this brings up the second part of no-fly zones. Since your own aircraft have to remain overhead patrolling the skies, they're at risk of being shot down by enemy SAM systems. So in order to patrol the skies and stop enemy aircraft, you also have to suppress and destroy air defenses on the ground as well. Russia has long-range S-400s in Crimea and near the border of Ukraine to the east and north, as well as numerous medium-range, highly mobile Buck and Cub systems inside Ukraine. So, as you can imagine, it gets pretty complicated quickly. You need fighter aircraft overhead, strike aircraft suppressing air defenses, along with airborne early warning aircraft with its powerful long-range radar to scan the skies for enemies, tanker aircraft in the air to refuel and keep the fighters on station longer, as well as a whole host of other support aircraft and equipment. So, if the US wants to do this, it's worth knowing what assets are within range of Ukraine. Aircraft can obviously be flown in from the US, but all the logistics, support equipment, etc. will take a little bit longer. So first, what is in the region right now? It gets a little tricky identifying every airbase and what's there, as a lot of units are regularly rotated around. And again, for simplicity's sake, this is just the US we're talking about. The responsibility of Ukraine falls under the 3rd Air Force of the US Air Force. It includes the 31st Fighter Wing in Italy, operating some 40 F-16s, the 48th Fighter Wing in the UK with roughly 20 F-15Cs, 40 F-15E Strike Eagles, and 20 F-35s, and also the 52nd Fighter Wing, based in Germany, with about 20 F-16 CJs, which are modified F-16s to suppress and destroy enemy air defenses. That, along with a tanker squadron, and other squadrons of Global Hawks, rivet joints, and more. Also, other wings are constantly being deployed temporarily, such as a dozen F-35s based in Utah just sent to Germany, B-52s to the UK, E-8 J-Star ground surveillance aircraft, EC-130 Compass Call electronic warfare aircraft, and others. Now, if the US did decide to enforce a no-fly zone, then they would undoubtedly send in E-3 Sentry airborne early warning aircraft, as well as any number of the 70-plus fighter squadrons stationed in the US, each one consisting of 18 to 24 aircraft. On top of that, right now the only aircraft carrier nearby is the Truman, currently in the Ionian Sea near Greece. It's part of Carrier Strike Group 8, which also includes a Ticonderoga-class cruiser and 5 Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers, and it has Carrier Air Wing 1, which consists of 4 fighter squadrons. So, in terms of flying combat air patrols and strike missions, the whole thing provides 40 to 48 FA-18 Super Hornets, along with somewhere around 250 Tomahawk cruise missiles on the warships. This all sounds like a lot, but you also have to factor in that roughly 1/3 of aircraft are down for maintenance at any given time. Also, it depends on the size of the enemy. Again, exact numbers are hard to find, and once any air combat began, Russia would likely be moving more fighter aircraft into the region, but in the vicinity, they have maybe 300 helicopters that could pose a threat to Ukrainian ground forces, so they'd have to be destroyed. And again, real rough numbers, but maybe 70 Su-24s, 90 Su-25s, 60 Su-27s, 60 Su-30s, 60 Su-34s, 25 Su-35s, along with dozens of transport, command and control, and other aircraft. Also, the advent of small drones makes no-fly zones much more complicated, as you're potentially sending in a $100 million aircraft to shoot down a $100 drone. On top of all that, at least 6 S-400 battalions and over a dozen Buck and Cub batteries. Adding to that could be dozens of more short-range Panzer, Tor, Osa, Strela, etc. that could threaten US aircraft enforcing any no-fly zone at lower altitudes. As for actual fighting, suppressing enemy air defense systems, especially the longer-range S-400s, would need to be first. Things like Tomahawk cruise missiles, or JASSMs from bombers, or a variety of other weapons from strike fighters would be required, along with heavy radar jamming. Once you finally achieve that, US fighters could then enter the skies and intercept Russian aircraft, and also locate and destroy the shorter range, but more mobile air defenses like Buck. Then they'd likely begin engaging Russian aircraft in the air, if Russia does decide to challenge them. The results of US and Russian aircraft in aerial combat and dogfighting has always been debated. Russian fighters tend to be somewhat more maneuverable, and therefore would be expected to perform better in a dogfight. However, US fighters are built to not have to get into dogfights, and instead have focused on more integrating systems and sensors, working in tandem with other assets and fighters to destroy an enemy from the outset. And while having a more capable aircraft helps win in aerial fights, a lot of it comes down to the pilot's skill. Russian pilots are believed to get roughly 100 hours of flying in a year, compared to double that in the US. So it's hard to predict with any certainty, but the US would likely have a big edge. The US could easily commit over 100 stealth fighters, whereas Russia itself only has a few Su-57s. But it doesn't mean that it won't be costly for the US and they'll lose several aircrafts themselves. Another issue in forcing a no-fly zone would be whether to simply wait for enemy aircraft to take off and enter the skies, which would risk engagement, or destroying them on the ground first when they're most vulnerable. And this is where it gets tricky. The US launching airstrikes on Russian air bases to stop them from entering Ukraine can quickly escalate into a much wider and possibly nuclear war. The same is true with Russia striking US bases or ships that are helping enforce that no-fly zone. It's incredibly risky. Even just US and Russian pilots shooting at each other in the skies has an incredibly high risk of escalating into World War III. So you really have to do a careful cost-benefit analysis. At worst, it could start World War III and large-scale nuclear war where everybody loses. At best, you shut down Russia's air capabilities. But even that best-case scenario does not guarantee Ukraine will win the war. Russia has deployed massive numbers of ground forces, and they've advanced right up and surrounded Ukraine's capital. Losing air support would make Russia's job somewhat more difficult, but not stop them. At which point, unless the US wanted to turn that no-fly zone into a no-drive zone as well, which includes attacking ground forces as well, it's unlikely to change the tide of the war, especially considering all the risks.